Welcome back to part 2 of my review on the musical 1776. If you haven't seen part 1 of my review yet, please go and check that out. Anyways, we come back to the story and it's the beginning of Scene 3. Scene 3 of 1776 is famous in musical history. There is a 40-minute gap between the last song, Delegates of Old Virginia, and the next song, But Mr. Adams. It holds the record for the longest time in a musical without a single note of music played or sung. The scene was so long that musicians were permitted to leave the pit during this scene. So get ready for a lot of talking and not a lot of singing. The scene takes place on June 7th, and we are introduced to a new character, Dr. Lyman Hall of Georgia.
I'm Dr. Lyman Hall, the new delegate from Georgia.
It's true that Georgia was not initially represented in the First Continental Congress. However, by the summer of 1775, Lyman Hall was already in Philadelphia participating as a member of Congress. So the timeline here has been shifted a little bit. However, I think it's a really great storytelling device, as we get to meet other members of Congress through Lyman Hall's perspective. We get to meet Stephen Hopkins of Rhode Island.
I'm Stephen Hopkins, old delegate from Rhode Island.
Fondly known as Old Grape and Guts. In the year 1776, he was 69 years old, the second oldest member of Congress, after Benjamin Franklin. He was one of those happy, funny drunks. As Adams wrote, Hopkins never drank to excess, but all he drank was immediately not only converted into wit, sense, knowledge, and good humor, but inspired us all with similar qualities. It's a shame because the musical portrays him as an alcoholic.
McNair, fetch 2 rum.
Oh, I fear it's a little early in the day.
Anyways, the next person we meet is Edward Rutledge.
Neddy, come over here and shake the hand of Dr. Lyman Hall of Georgia.
I can't find any record of Rutledge ever having the nickname Neddy, as he is called by Hopkins in the musical. But it's cute to imagine that the Founding Fathers all had these nicknames for each other. Anyways, Rutledge was the youngest member of Congress and was only 26 at the time. He plays an important role in the musical as an opposer of independence. We'll talk more in depth about him later. We then meet Joseph Hughes of North Carolina. In the movie, North Carolina is just pushed to the side as an echo chamber for South Carolina. As Neddy explains,
the Deep South speaks with one voice. It's traditional.
However, this was not the case. The two Carolinas definitely had different opinions when it came to the question of independence. North Carolina, alongside Virginia, was one of the first states to endorse independence and would not have tolerated being pushed around by South Carolina. I think this change was made to simplify the plot, with the southern states opposing independence and the northern states endorsing it. In reality, it was much more complicated than that. Next, we meet the Delegates of Delaware. All 3 Delegates of Delaware are represented in the musical.
Cecil Rodney.
An honor, sir.
Sir. George Reed. And Colonel Thomas McKeon.
There was some drama in the Delaware delegation, because Caesar Rodney and Thomas McKeon were in favor of independence, but George Reed opposed it. By the way, if you're wondering what's up with Caesar Rodney, he suffered from skin cancer on his face. He also had asthma and therefore was generally ill and in pain throughout his life. We then get to meet John Dickinson of Pennsylvania. If we had to choose a villain in the story, he is the one.
Where do you stand on the question of
Independence?
treason?
Dickinson strongly opposed independence, but the way his character is portrayed in the musical does not describe the nuance of his argument. Dickinson was born to a Quaker family. Quakers are pacifists, meaning they don't engage in physical confrontation. He wished for reconciliation with England and not revolution. Dickinson wrote the Olive Branch Petition, the last attempt for peace with Britain. In the musical, the depth in this character is not really explored. He's simply there as a rival to John Adams. We also meet James Wilson, another delegate from Pennsylvania. In the musical, he's kind of a pushover, always just agreeing with what Dickinson says.
Oh, Judge Wilson, forgive me, but how can anyone see you if you insist on standing in Mr. Dickinson's shadow?
It's true that in real life, John Dickinson was a mentor to James Wilson. However, Wilson was firmly in favor of independence. The change in this character in the musical does serve a purpose in the plot, which we will find out later. We then see a spectacular entrance by Benjamin Franklin, carried into Congress on a sedan chair. Ben Franklin suffered from gout and was unable to walk without major pain. He brought the sedan chair from Paris and apparently did not use it frequently, but when he did, he would hire prisoners from Walnut Street Jail to carry him around.
Good morning, all.
Morning, man. Here you are, 2 coppers apiece. Now straight back to jail with you.
Back to the story, we see President John Hancock bring Congress to order. We then get Secretary Charles Thomson call roll, and we discover the entire delegation of New Jersey has not been present at the Second Continental Congress. Now, New Jersey did have delegates present at the Second Continental Congress, but in 1776, New Jersey legislatures decided to send a new set of delegates who were instructed to vote in favor of independence. So it's possible that there was a gap between when the old delegates left and when the new delegates arrived.
Dr. Franklin, have you heard anything? Your son resides there.
Son, sir? What son?
The Royal Governor of New Jersey, sir.
As that title might suggest, sir, we are not in touch at the present time.
Yeah, Ben Franklin and his son's relationship was not great. William was technically Franklin's illegitimate son, but was raised as a member of Franklin's official family. Of his son's decision to stay loyal to the king, Franklin wrote, "Nothing has ever hurt me so much as to find myself deserted in my old age by my only son." Next, we meet Thomas Jefferson.
Mr. Jefferson!
Oh, present, sir.
Jefferson is shown to be a quiet, introverted man throughout the musical. Adams wrote,
"Most silent man in Congress. I've never heard him utter 3 sentences together."
Yep, that's a real quote. We see throughout the musical that Jefferson is passionately in love with his wife and planned on leaving Philadelphia to return to Virginia to be by her side.
Tonight I'm leaving for home.
It's true that Jefferson was begging to be returned to Virginia in the summer of 1776. He wanted to be in Williamsburg to participate in writing the Virginia Constitution. He also wanted to see his wife, but not so much for romantic reasons. In the summer of 1776, his wife was ill after suffering a miscarriage. Unfortunately, Jefferson did not make it home that summer to be with her. We'll get to learn more about Martha Jefferson later in the musical. Then enters the Courier. He appears a number of times throughout the musical and brings the dispatches from General Washington. These dispatches, read by Mr. Thompson, reminds us of the war that's happening across the country. It gives us some perspective that it was not an easy decision to support independence. It seemed very uncertain whether we could win the Revolutionary War.
How can a nation of only 2 million souls stand up to an empire of 10 million? Think of it, 10 million!
We then see the return of Richard Henry Lee. He reads what we now call the Lee Resolution.
Mr. President, I return from Virginia with the following resolution.
Yup, that was it, a nice short and sweet declaration. The motion was seconded by Adams.
Mr. President, I second the proposal.
The journals of the Continental Congress show a record of the matters discussed in Congress that day, but the note-keeping is nothing like what we have today. We have no idea who said what, or any of the intricacies that might have been discussed. After the Lee Resolution was proposed, it kind of just says, I don't know, let's talk about this again tomorrow. The decision keeps on getting postponed until they decide to hold the official vote on July 1st. This gave all of the colonies 3 weeks to make up their mind. We don't know who suggested the vote to be pushed to July 1st, and we don't know why they thought 3 weeks was the appropriate amount of time. We know that the Founding Fathers like to go drinking together, and I'm sure many of these discussions and debates happened in private. So, everything that happens between the introduction of the Lee Resolution and July 1st is kind of up to interpretation. So the writer gets to imagine what the debates might have looked like. In the musical, the 13 colonies do a preliminary vote. As far as we know, this did not happen. But it's useful for the story for us to learn which delegates Adams still needs to convince. The big board with yay or nay is also fictional, but again a great way to visualize how much progress Adams needs to make. In this preliminary vote, the votes come to
5 for debate, 5 for postponement, 1 abstention, and 1 absence.
Stephen Hopkins returns from the bathroom and finds that the decision rests on him. He comments,
You'd think that Congress would have its own privy.
I wasn't able to find any information on whether the Pennsylvania State House had its own restrooms in 1776. However, archaeologists have discovered privy pits in Independence Hall that were built in 1790. There were also privy pits and a tavern just 2 blocks away from Independence Hall. Archaeologists believe they were built on July 10th of 1776. So I think it's totally possible that our founding fathers were running a few blocks just to use the bathroom. Going back to the story, Stephen Hopkins votes in favor of debating independence.
Hell yes, I'm for debating anything. Rhode Island says yay.
A reminder that everything that happens in this debate is fiction. However, the topics that are brought up are things that the Founding Fathers would have discussed. The first part of the debate is dominated by John Dickinson, and he brings up many good points. Not all 13 colonies had a strained relationship with England. Massachusetts was the epicenter of civilian revolt.
Damn it, man, we're at war! Right now!
You may be at war. You, Boston and John Adams. But you will never speak for Pennsylvania.
Nor for Delaware. Mr. Reed.
Dickinson also argues that yes, the taxes are too high.
Your taxes are too high. Well, sir, so are mine.
But that is the price you pay to be a part of the most powerful empire on Earth.
For myself, I have no objection at all to being part of the greatest empire on Earth, to enjoying its protection and sharing its benefits.
Indeed, many Americans would have considered themselves Englishmen. Even Franklin, who argues against Dickinson, would have considered himself an Englishman for the majority of his life. Franklin lived in London for a number of years and even considered settling down there. But he argues that their rights as Englishmen have been violated by the king.
Never was such a valuable possession so stupidly and so recklessly managed than this entire continent by the British Crown.
Adams argues that Dickinson and others are interested in staying with England not necessarily out of national pride, but for economic purposes.
Is nothing more than the eternal preservation of your own property.
England was America's main trading partner, and as discussed in Part 1, the US struggled to secure important resources like gunpowder without importation from Britain. In the second part of the debate, we get to hear from Edward Rutledge, delegate of South Carolina. He asks,
after we have achieved independence, who do you propose would govern in South Carolina?
The people, of course.
Which people, sir? The people of South Carolina or the people of Massachusetts?
His statement reminds us that most people didn't identify as Americans. They identified as New Yorkers or Virginians, with each colony having its own identity. And there was a concern amongst founding fathers to preserve those sovereign identities. You can see how important this issue was just by looking at how our government works today. We also hear from Samuel Chase of Maryland.
Why must this question be settled now?
What's wrong with now, Mr. Chase?
General Washington is in the field. If he's defeated, as it now appears, we'll be inviting the hangman. But if, by some miracle, he should actually win, we can then declare anything we damn please.
I mean, his argument makes a lot of sense. Why declare independence if they haven't won the war yet? To which John Adams responds,
Has it ever occurred to either of you that an army needs something to fight for in order to win? A purpose, a goal, a flag of its own?
Dickinson chimes in.
No army, no navy, no arms, no ammunition, no treasury, no friends. But bless our soul, spirit.
This argument escalates into a physical fight, which seems unlikely again because of Dickinson's pacifist background. Caesar Rodney intervenes but becomes ill and is taken home by Thomas McKean. Remember that Delaware was split in opinion, with Caesar Rodney and Thomas McKean for independence, and George Reed being against it. Once these pro-independence delegates leave, Rutledge calls for the vote to be taken again, knowing that now Delaware will vote against independence. This is when New Jersey shows up. Learning that New Jersey will vote in favor of independence, Dickinson, in a desperate move, proposes that the vote for independence must be unanimous.
Any vote in favor of independence must be unanimous.
We know it's true that the Founding Fathers decided that independence must be a unanimous vote, but it wasn't because of a push from the anti-independence faction. They knew that they had to stick together. In an effort to buy more time, John Adams proposes that an official declaration be written. to be presented in 3 weeks' time.
Mr. President, how can this Congress vote on independence without a written declaration of some sort defining it?
Again, this whole bit is fiction. Remember, we don't have records of any decision actually being made on June 7th when the Lee resolution was proposed. It's only on June 10th when they finally decide to postpone the decision until July 1st, and the Committee of Five assigned to draft the Declaration of Independence only forms on June 11th. But it's a humorous way of creating tension in the story. Anyways, we see the delegates vote on whether to postpone the vote for independence. Now, in the musical, New York has this bit where every time there's a vote, they abstain.
New York abstains courteously. New York abstains courteously.
New York abstains
courteously.
And John Hancock finally cracks.
Mr. Morris.
What in hell goes on in New York?
I'm sorry, Mr. President, but the simple fact is that our legislature has never sent us explicit instructions on anything.
This is actually true. Spoiler alert. But they eventually get a unanimous vote for independence. But only 12 colonies voted in favor of independence, and New York abstained, because they weren't sure of how their constituents would want them to vote.
They speak very fast and very loud, and nobody listens to anybody else, with the result that nothing ever gets done.
Anyways, we see John Hancock put together the members of the committee that will draft the Declaration of Independence.
Dr. Franklin.
Gladly.
Mr. John Adams.
Yes.
Mr. Sherman. Mr. Livingston.
Right.
Oh, and of course, Mr. Lee.
He initially assigns Richard Henry Lee to this committee. After all, he is the one that triggered this entire thing. However, Richard Henry Lee claims,
"Excuse me, but I must be returning to the sovereign colony of Virginia, as I have been asked to serve as governor."
Richard Henry Lee actually never served as governor of Virginia, although his cousin Lighthorse Harry did. Lee simply wasn't present on June 11th when this decision was made. He'd gone back to Virginia to tend to his sick wife, so John Adams suggested that Thomas Jefferson take Lee's place.
Just a moment, this business needs a Virginian, therefore I propose a replacement, Mr. Thomas Jefferson.
No, Mr. Adams. Very well, Mr. Adams. Mr. Jefferson will serve.
So this part is very accurate. So that's it for part 2 of my review on the musical 1776. I hope you enjoyed it. Part 3 is definitely coming, so keep your eyes out.